Hi, I'm Guy Delore, and this is the first chapter of my book Singularity, which is about peace, love, understanding, technology, and the brutal murder of the world. It's a science fiction novel, and it is going to be performed for you by me as I write each chapter. I finish a draft, I do a video of me reading the draft, and then I work on the next chapter. So it should be a fairly interesting experience for you and for me. And I guess without any further ado, here we go. On his belly in a ditch along the only road that led up or down his mountain, Lloyd Robinson listened carefully to the approaching footfalls. He counted 2 intruders and found their silence ominous. Only once had anyone trespassed on his land, and that had been a honeymooning couple who'd run out of gas on their way through the valley below. Their chatter had let him know that they came with no ill will, and by contrast this silence felt surreptitious. Then, as now, a silent alarm had triggered when the gate was crossed, and Lloyd had left his small cabin, shotgun in hand, to investigate. The insubstantial falling rain was scattered to mist in its descent through the trees, so that it drifted silently the last few feet from canopy to earth. Lloyd's difficulty in hearing the footsteps despite the quiet meant that they must be very light. The intruders were either sneaking or— "Come on, Johnny, quit being such a sissy." Children. 2 of them. Lloyd rose and laid down his shotgun on the side of the ditch, safely out of the clear water that flowed down the mountain, hugging the road as it went. He was obscured from the road by a line of low, ragged shrubs, and wore his customary light camouflage jacket. They wouldn't see him until it was too late. "Man, I don't know about this. Let's go back, Jim. I won't tell anybody if you don't." "Come on. Let's just go touch the cabin and then we'll run back. Don't puss out now." The boys' steps quickened as they reached the top of the long rising road and saw the old hermit's cabin. "I don't want to get bitten by a vampire," blubbered the frightened boy, drawing the final vowel out with the endearing drawl of the locals in this part of the country. "Johnny, Dad laughed his butt off after he told you that story. You must be as stupid as you look if you think it's true." "I don't want to get bitten by anybody else, either," Johnny mumbled to himself from the rear. Despite his facade, the older brother's private nervousness prodded him into a run across the last 30 yards to the cabin, and he was almost there when he heard a scream from behind him. He whirled, tripping and landing on his butt as his momentum carried him backwards the way he'd been going. A huge man, naked from the waist up and blacker than anyone Jim had ever seen in real life, was holding Jimmy by his stretching shirt, pulling him from his feet and dodging his panicked kicks. Johnny's arms and legs pinwheeled with the panic of incomprehension, but the man was too strong. In a moment he had the boy's arms pinned by his side. He lowered his head, opened his mouth, and sunk his white teeth into Johnny's neck. Johnny's scream was the high, constant note they used as a sound effect in horror flicks, and his writhing body was the physical embodiment of that perfect, senseless fear. Jim scrambled up from the ground and ran at the man holding his brother, adding his own childish roar to the sudden cacophony in the previously silent woods. He leapt when he was near enough and wrapped his arms and legs around the dark, enormous form. His hand found hair behind the man's back, and he yanked it as hard as he could. The monster stumbled back, howling and dropping Johnny, who landed on his feet and took off like quicksilver down the slope of the road. Jim sprinted after him, never looking back. If he had, he would have seen the man's bright white teeth spread in a genuine smile of mirth. Lloyd was still chuckling as he took his jacket off the branch stub where he'd hung it and pulled it on again, reaching over his shoulder and flicking his long dreadlocks outside the collar. The boy's yank had hurt like hell, but it had been worth it to see him defend his little brother so bravely. He hadn't bitten the young one's neck at all, of course, just opened his mouth and pressed his teeth against it, but that wouldn't change anything. The attack would be real in their minds because they wanted it to be true. Through all their fear, children needed desperately to live interesting lives, and for everyone else to know it. No doubt they'd repeat this story for years at every opportunity, weaving it each time with a little more danger, a little more injury, a little more spice. Soon enough, Lloyd was sure he'd be 10 feet tall and foaming at the mouth with pointed incisors. That ought to keep the children of Darby off his property for a while. As he shut the door to the cabin behind him, he took off all his clothes and put on the black boxers and ski socks he wore indoors. His dress around the house had been one of the first things to change when he and his wife separated. Without her, there was no reason not to set the thermostat to his preferred constant of 70, nor any reason to wear more clothes than he wanted to. As long as his toes were warm and his business was covered, Lloyd was a happy man. He stepped to the stove and put a kettle on to make some tea, still whistling his happiness with mischief well managed, and then jumped onto the half of the staircase that wasn't a staircase at all, but a smooth hardwood ramp down which a sock-wearing man might slide. Like the rest of the house, the slide had been custom-made by an expensive but talented group of contractors. The entire basement, which was 4 times the size of the cabin visible from outside, was sunk under 5 feet of earth and encased in a concrete shell designed to prevent eroding soil or tree roots from compromising the space. The designer had said, only half-jokingly with the awkward humor unique to engineers, that it would hold up reasonably well in a nuclear holocaust. Why anyone would nuke the edge of a wilderness reserve in Idaho, of all places, Lloyd did not know. Still, being nuke-proof did engender a certain sense of security. He flopped down in an easy chair by the fireplace and grabbed his copy of Discipline and Punish by Michel Foucault. It was the kind of dense philosophical book that never would have made it to the top of his reading list before he'd moved here. When he was still with Sherry, she'd filled up almost all of his free time. She'd filled up almost all of the free time left to him by his constantly evolving careers, first as an accountant, then an economist, and finally as a lobbyist for Big Pharma. He'd had a few minutes before bed here and there, but he spent them mostly reading fiction. He and Sherry had been an odd pair. She was the petite, high-achieving daughter of a rich Canadian television producer, while he was the son of 2 Ghanaian emigres who had settled on Tuck Lake, a tiny gem nestled in the mountainous temperate rainforest of Vancouver Island. Both of his parents had college degrees and managed to work from home through a satellite internet connection successfully enough that they could stay in their valley, far from the world, and shape the alien landscape in simple-minded peace. Lloyd had been given a name that wouldn't make him stand out in Canada, though by the time he was 17 the question was rendered moot by his height and strength, which made him a giant in any crowd. Also, of course, he was usually the only black person, or at least the darkest. Sherry had approached him for a date in college, where, after being homeschooled his entire life, he was learning how to socialize. She would later claim that she only dated him because it would piss off her father, which it certainly did, but the truth was that they were a deliriously happy couple. The college years were a haze of laughter, love-making, and adventure. Lloyd showed her the beauty of the wilderness, and she reduced social life to first principles for him until he was more confident even than her. He got a job doing the books for a design firm, and she worked for her father's television production company, so they both made it through college without debt and with good jobs lined up. They married at the apogee of potential, when it seemed like nothing could go wrong. Lloyd rose from his chair to attend to the insistently whistling kettle. It was the domestic concerns that had shattered the bliss. Moving in with Sherry had required adjustment, and not just of the socks and boxers sort. In school, they saw each other whenever they had a free lunch or evening, and went on trips each weekend. It felt as though each time they saw each other, they were choosing each other over again. In their new co-domesticity, their relationship was relegated to the default. It was the status quo which persisted without effort, and the inertial stillness led inevitably to corrosion. They both understood that to live together and to constantly be together was to accept something less than perfection. Small slights should go unanswered, and tiny gripes unsaid. Toilet seats and unwashed dishes were never mentioned, but eventually became sign language between them. She would decide not to vacuum if he had forgotten to flush. There's like 7 pages of blank paper in the middle of my manuscript. That's so weird. Okay. What the fuck? There were more serious offenses as well. She mocked Lloyd's Christianity, and he her atheism. She jokingly brought up from time to time the fact that... Sorry, that's so weird. She jokingly brought up from time to time the fact that her salary was more than twice his. He replied that she was riding on her father's coattails, and said it with a smile. It left him feeling caustic because he knew that she was only half joking, that she did want him to make more money. In her world, money was power. It was masculine and central. Her father's salary made her mother's trivial, and the power dynamic that followed from that was how she envisioned a marriage. He recognized that it was unreasonable for him to begrudge her that, despite the patriarchy it resembled to him. She was shaping her relationship after her parents, and there was nothing more natural than that. He did the same thing, after all, wishing that she could emulate the simplicity and acceptance, the sharing and oneness of his parents' marriage. Lloyd's reply in their habitual little exchange chipped another stone from her shoulder. She wanted to succeed on her own merits, and was deeply self-conscious that she'd gotten such a head start from her father's position. Though they still loved each other, these minuscule resentments left unspoken drained into an increasingly septic shared consciousness, the fumes from which periodically rose up and possessed them with their rancor. Throughout the 10 years of their marriage, even as the resentments drove him to better and better paying jobs and her to fierce independence, they fought more and more. The umbrage from 10 tiny insults flashed up like a geyser on the 11th, for her as a sharply aimed sniping comment, and for him as a roar of rage and a few words of anger. Always they decompressed soon enough, taking a walk, a shower, a cool drink. They apologized and made up, and yet the malaise lingered. By the time he finally surpassed her salary, rather spectacularly, by taking a job as the financial shuffler for the pharmaceutical lobby in Washington, D.C., their interactions were totally anesthetized. To avoid offense, they never said anything with any color to it. Gone was the vibrant joking, the myriad musings on a million topics. In their place was a watercolor pastel farce of a love. Those were her words, in her final letter to him preceding their amicable divorce. The tea was cold. He poured it down the sink, put his pants and jacket back on, and headed out into the rain. He walked the mile to his mailbox, reflecting on what he could have done differently. If he could have been able to communicate what he felt instead of letting it build upon itself, would that have been enough? Not unless she had done the same, he decided. And she wouldn't have, because she would have thought that he was being cruel to her and wouldn't want to answer in kind. Excuse me. They couldn't communicate because of the barriers they'd built around themselves, because of the rule sets of their interactions. Many times, when his thoughts brought him down this road, some internal voice whispered that they were just incompatible partners, but he'd long since rejected that hypothesis as a cop-out. There had to be a chain of causality to follow, and a set of actions that would have amended their trajectory. There was a misstep somewhere along the line, or a flaw in his character, and he'd find it. Until then, he'd stay here in the woods. He reached the mailbox and sorted out the junk. There were 2 bills and a plain envelope remaining. Tucking the bills under one arm and the junk under the other, he opened the envelope. The single folded paper inside was blank, save one centered line of text. It read, "What's wrong with the world?" Lloyd flipped the envelope over, looking for an address, but there was none, not even his, so it must have been put there by some person other than the mailman. He turned over the sheet itself, but the back was blank too. Someone asking philosophical questions of a hermit? Some joke by the townies? Lloyd wasn't sure, but didn't care much. He was suddenly aware that he was in no mood to deal with either, and he tucked the mysterious letter in with the junk to be used to start a fire. He'd try again with the tea. So that's it. Chapter 1, done. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm sorry for the interjection of random blank pages. Make sure that you subscribe if you ever want to see one of my videos again, because chances are pretty good that you won't see it otherwise. And bye.